Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Kramer. I'm the Assistant University Librarian at Stanford University, and somewhat uncharacteristically for me, I was hoping for a slightly smaller audience. Because I'm here not with, I feel like, stunning insights or brilliance, which I always like to feel I'm bringing when I talk, but rather a growing sense of uncertainty and a fundamental question. And that question is, what does digital preservation have to do with digital repositories? We often conflate these two things in this community and in the digital preservation community, and the two things are deeply intertwined. When the repositories that make up the backbone of this community started in around the late 1990s and the early 2000s, there was a wonderful convergence of both open access consideration and concerns and digital preservation. OAIS had just come out. There were terms about concern about the digital dark ages, and libraries moved in and felt like, yes, we have found a sweet spot. And if you attended conferences or if you look at the literature from the early 2000s, if you see references to DSpace, ePrints, and Fedora, they're often referred to as digital preservation systems. The two things really were the same. Personally, I've been deeply involved with two digital repositories, so both Fedora and, well, I guess three now, Fedora, Hydra, and Samvera. And I've also done instruction and led courses in digital preservation. I've been involved in the Jove 2 project, where I got to work with people who are deeply steeped and much more clever in this than I was. And so I think I understand both of the worlds and both of the perspectives, but increasingly I feel like I have to be schizophrenic and shift my mind between the practical problems of ingesting content, managing it, and providing access to it. So the how-to versus digital preservation, where it's a little bit more abstract. There are bigger concerns around things, around how do you model things? What does it mean to be secure? What does it, over the long term, what does it mean to provide long-term access? And it's always a little bit drifting on top of the surface. So I'm here today hoping to shed some light on this through this process. And before I get into this, let me ask, so this is a community of people who are at a conference called Open Repositories. How many people have read OAIS? How many people have read the ISO standard? Okay, so it's about half, 45%. How many people have read the Trustworthy Digital Repository Standard? Okay, it's not the same people, which is interesting, or not all the same people, but it's also about 40%. Okay, so I'm going to start off with just a somewhat practical perspective, I think, on what is digital preservation, and go into some of the models that define our current notions of long-term digital preservation, LTDP. Try to do some observations about what are the practical implications for repositories with long-term digital preservation, and then two brief case studies, one on Fedora and one from Hydra, about trying to understand how these systems map to the more formal notions. Understand where finding the balance is. Where, as a repository community, could we be doing better in infusing our systems and practices with digital preservation concerns? And on the other side, because this isn't IPRES, where do the preservationists have it wrong? Where are they barking up the wrong tree, or they're gazing at their navels? It was a shorter list than I thought it would be when I prepared the slide. And then finally, maybe a little bit of forecasting where the forces of change are, and how these things might shift moving into the future. I will go hopefully somewhat quickly. I don't know if it's going to be, I wrote the abstract before I wrote the talk, and I thought I would come with big revelations and say caustic things that got people up in a storm. I don't know if I'll do that, but if there is time for discussion, either at this session or at the reception or tomorrow, I really would appreciate people's thoughts on this, because I don't know what the answers are. So first of all, what is digital preservation? So textbook answer is digital preservation is the series of strategies and actions taken to promote the availability and usability of digital information over time. And if you look at a couple of different things, that's a period of time that's long enough where changes in the environment, user expectations, or the designated community would otherwise present risks to the information that you've stored in your repository. And if you look at write-ups about threat models, there are a variety of them, and you can get these from different kinds of seminars, but you look at things like media decay or bit rot, which is a tremendous area of focus in the late 90s and early 2000s in particular. There's a lot of concern about obsolescence, so formats may go obsolete, software, hardware, or the media that's carrying it. If you lose the player, you can't actually extract the data. There are issues around technology failure. So software, hardware, or media just breaks from time to time. If you don't have multiple copies and some kind of redundancy, you're at risk. Digital information is always copied. There always has to be some kind of communication. If there is a communication error, even if the first copy is good, the second copy can be corrupted. You have things like lack of context, where if you have the data but not the metadata, what the heck is it? IP is for all the librarians in the room. We know that intellectual property can be a tremendous barrier to the reuse and use of information over time. If you can't legally deliver it, there are certain restrictions. And then you have the more classical things like natural disasters, information attack, economic failure, organizational failure, loss of will, which Mary mentioned, which is we just want to give up. We don't really care about saving this all the more, or funding priorities. I heard was earlier today was an excellent term of art. And then human error. And then for digital preservation, you can think about, there are things like you want to replicate, you want to have lots of copies. We migrate formats, media, and technology from time to time. Emulation has really emerged in the last several years. You want to encapsulate your metadata and maybe the software to render your digital objects with the object itself. So you have a nice little package that's mothballed and might be renderable. Redundancy and heterogeneity at all of the levels, and Sybil mentioned many of them: technology, organizational, financial, geopolitical, and have succession planning. And we all know, I think, that digital preservation, you cannot pickle information. You cannot put it in a system or put it into an organization and say it's preserved, because it's a journey, it's not a destination. It's a series of relays over time. And for the repository, the developers and the system architects in the community, so what are the implications? And I think we've learned these lessons well. And in general, there's fairly good application within the repository space. So you want to minimize your dependencies in things like encapsulate your metadata. So if you have, as Mary was saying, your data in one system and your metadata in a different system, both systems have to be up if you want the complete view of the object. That's bad. I think we know that. You want to minimize correlated errors, so don't put all of your digital copies in the same fault line if you have a data center that is 1.5 miles from the San Andreas Fault. You want to embrace diversity in terms of different technologies and different organizations, different locations. Monolithic systems, I think we know, tend to serve poorly. They're complex, they're expensive, they're inflexible, but most of all, because of this notion of relays, if you have a huge, expensive system, you're going to need to refresh that. And when you refresh that, if you can't afford to refresh it with another huge, expensive system, like going from a mainframe to another mainframe, you're going to lose that information when that first system peters out. And then finally, as the previous speakers have identified, keep it simple and have an exit plan for every component. And I think, again, the open repositories flavor and spirit, we've done a lot of these things pretty well. Now, taking a step back, digital preservation is a whole series of strategies and activities. It's not just technology. And from the Council of Research Libraries and TRAC, the Trustworthy Repositories Audit Checklist, they have a couple of really good guides. And one of the things that they've produced is 10 core requirements for a digital archive. And of the 10, only 4 to 5 of them actually deal with the technology. So the first thing is you have to have a mandate and commitment to digital object maintenance, organizational fitness. One, you have to be concerned with digital preservation to be a good digital archive. 2 is your organization actually has to be able to do it. You have to have the laws and regulations able to preserve the information, to do it legally. You have to have policies, and you have to have adequate technical infrastructure. 6 through 9 are really the areas where I think digital repositories are engaged. So you have to be able to acquire and ingest content. You have to be able to see to the preservation of objects, their integrity, their authenticity, and their usability. You have to be able to manage their metadata, their audit trails, and you have to be able to disseminate the information, because if you bring it in but can't deliver it out, you're not providing access. You're failing. And then finally, there's this notion of preservation planning, which is as shifts in the environment happen, can you take appropriate action and control for them? Because again, it's a journey, not a destination. So some of the formal models for long-term digital preservation, this is one that is great. Everyone has seen this, and you have your 6 major components of the Open Archival Information System functional model, with data being ingested on the left, going into archive as a SIP is produced, a submission information package. It goes into archival storage, where it magically becomes an APE, and then people want it, and it becomes a DIP, dissemination or delivery information package. You have your data management environment, which is the day-to-day catalog of what's in your repository and where it's located. You have your administration, which is the actual administrative function of the people who are running your archive, and then the preservation planning, which is this longer strategic monitoring and action-taking notion. And it's feeding a producer, which is the information provider, and delivering to a consumer. The other kind of kingpin that's not shown as much is the information model, where you have this notion where you actually have the content is actually one small part of the files, the payload is one small part of what makes up an archival information package. You also have things called representation information, which is what's the additional information that a user or a consumer needs to have in order to interpret the information, the payload. And then you have this notion of PDI, or preservation description information, where you have things like reference numbers, the provenance of the data, the context, where was it located, where did it come from, what else do I need to understand it, and the fixity information, what's the actual bit stream. And all of that is described that go into the management system for the catalog. So I have even heard David Gioretta, who was one of the main drivers of OAIS and also Trustworthy Digital Repositories, say that people take OAIS too seriously. And that's, for David Gioretta to say that is remarkable. Okay, so he is preaching not to the over-converted. And it is really a description of good practice and good foundations. It is not a system architecture, and it is not a specific data model. So don't take it too literally. If you produce a digital repository that has components that match each one of those systems, you may have gone too far. And I don't think that describes any of the repositories generally present in this kind of room. But really some of the benefits are the shared concepts and the shared vocabulary, and the foundation for doing other things like putting together certification bodies for what really makes a good or trustworthy digital archive. Which is described in ISO 16363, which is the kind of the descendant of TRAC and TDR. And if you look at the standard, which is like 120 pages long, there are 6 or 7 major sections. There are 3 sections which describe what a digital archive, a trustworthy digital archive, has to do. And the other is like the introduction and context and a conclusion. But one is organizational infrastructure, second is digital object management, and third is infrastructure and security risk management. And the technical infrastructure is really, do you have the server environment and storage to take care of your stuff? So what I think we are concerned with in this room is the digital object management system. And this is a case where the schizophrenia, this is a screenshot from the PDF, this is a case where the schizophrenia comes out for me. So actually there are very good parts to OAIS. So this one, so section 4241 says the repository shall uniquely identify each ape within the repository. The repository shall have unique identifiers. The repository shall assign and maintain persistent identifiers of the ape and its components so as to be unique within the context of the repository. Okay, so that's all like standard speak for give unique identifiers, don't reuse them, and keep track of them. I think we're doing pretty well, all right? Another example, the repository shall have documented processes for acquiring preservation description information, PDI, for its associated content and acquire the PDI in accordance with documented processes. And so it gives examples of if you have submission agreements, if you're capturing license information, if you have actual contracts, if you're capturing descriptive metadata, all of that goes into the PDI and the wrapper. Again, as Mary was saying, I think this is common sense or commonly accepted at this point. You don't just take in the files and not worry about the metadata because we know you're not preserving it. That's just curation debt. We do a good job across DSpace, ePrints, Fedora, Islandora, Samvera, and Venio. Then you get into some of the overly formal, and I think this is where the preservationists begin maybe spending a little bit too much time on their islands or up in their own trees. So the ingest, acquisition of content. The repository shall identify the content information and the information properties that the repository will preserve. And you need to know what you're bringing in so it can be clear to funders, depositors, and users what the responsibilities of the repository are. Mary said it's actually hard, especially for smaller organizations that don't have a lot of staff to understand this. I'm at a big organization. I spend a lot of time reading this. I don't understand this, right? Kind of decoding this. What is the actual implication for my repository if I'm trying to manage content and provide access? So you can probably distill it. You can probably write something up to pass an audit, which several organizations have done, but I'm not sure how helpful it is. There are also other things that fall outside digital object management which are mostly out of scope. This repository shall have an appropriate succession plan, contingency plans, and/or escrow arrangements in place in case the repository ceases to operate. Now, at a certain point, this is saying when you aren't there anymore, you'll have a plan for what happens when you're not there. That's very hard to code for, right? It doesn't matter how good any of our repositories are. This is talking about something that exists outside the repository. So it's sort of an existential question. So how does this actually apply or inform what we do with digital repositories? Because some of it is just hard to translate or hard to say what are the lessons. So the NDSA is the National Digital Stewardship Association, is the successor organization to NDIP in the United States, which was a federally funded effort to build a digital preservation infrastructure in the States, and is the precursor to now something called digital preservation, somewhat generically and confusingly to me. And what they try to do is take a lot of the highfalutin language and translate it into, if you're just getting started or if you want to, don't make the perfect the enemy of the good, what are the various levels from protecting your data to knowing your data to monitoring your data to repairing your data in several categories. So as they've broken this down, for storage and geographic location, have at least 2 copies is level 1 protection. To have at least 3 copies in geographic locations with different disaster threats is like the master level. What are the implications for open repositories? Well, one is I think we need to be open. We have to realize that I don't think most or maybe all of our repositories are actually managing the storage and the location on policy based on a geographic information system from DSpace, ePrints, and Venio. These are things that are largely outside the purview of the repository application. I think that's actually appropriate, but it does mean that we should be working with storage providers and storage systems, some of which we saw exemplified in the previous one. It also means exporting and integrating your digital objects to distributed digital preservation services. File fixity and data integrity. It's check your files is level 1, check your files regularly and repair them is like level 4. I think we do this in general on ingest. Many of our repositories don't necessarily do this on a recurring basis, don't necessarily log it and report it out. And if you do want to report it out, you often have to do this via your own administrative UI. It's not something that's exposed via an API. This is an area where I think our repositories could be doing better. Certainly when we're deploying storage subsystems, we always ask it of the vendors, can I do a fixity check on demand, and will you get the fixity check that I want to run, not the one that you have built in, and will you report the results to me? I think this is an area for opportunity. NDSA levels of preservation information security. Lock down your stuff, basically. Don't let people in. I think all of our systems are actually doing this. So I'm not sure why that made the cut. Metadata. Inventory, know what your data is and have metadata for it. Store administrative metadata, store standard technical and descriptive metadata, store standard preservation metadata. Well, you can't do the last one because I don't know what standard preservation metadata is. And I hope they don't come up with a standard for it because it would be Baroque. So I think in general, we're doing pretty well. Again, we have this notion that digital objects are more than just the payload, it's also the metadata that comes with it. I think there is a fair amount of work to do as a community in terms of determining what preservation actions are actually worth tracking, because it is almost certainly not all of the premise events that have been described in like a 500-page document about every possible thing that could happen to your digital object, because it is just a lot of noise. Okay, now maybe I'm getting riled up. So someone throw down at me if they want to on that. But I'm still looking for someone who's done that really well and important. File formats. You have to be able to know what you have in your repository. You have to be able to bring it in. You have to be able to, and then level 4, perform format migrations and emulations and similar activities as needed. I believe format migration within the repository is probably bunk. I think this is an area where the preservationists are looking into their navels. That said, I think we all do format migration on access, or on ingest, excuse me, and some of us do it on access. So I don't know a single repository that just takes anything that you want and doesn't worry about the formats. If you're bringing stuff in a self-deposit environment or as a digital collection, that's where the bottleneck comes from that Mary was just describing. I want to get it organized because being organized before it comes in the repository is a prerequisite to being in the repository. So we went through, some of you may know Declan Fleming. From University of California, San Diego. He has spent a lot of time really concerned about this. He's also kind of dogmatic and stubborn. And he's the current chair of the Fedora Leaders Group, and he's very concerned. He moved to Fedora, kind of a late in life conversion, and he said, well, Fedora is not really a digital preservation system. And then like 90 of us in the Fedora Leaders Group said, Declan, what are you smoking? Of course it's a digital preservation system. And because he had a very specific definition of what digital preservation was in mind. And so we had what turned out to be one of the best conversations in the digital repository community that I've been part of in the last 10 years about what is digital preservation. And we produced this statement, which is available at the URL at the bottom, that talks about how Fedora is not in toto a digital preservation system, but is a key part of a digital preservation strategy. And if you look at it, there are things like it is community-led, it is open source, so many eyes catch more bugs and reduce vulnerabilities. It's standards-based, so you're not going to get locked in, and it's interoperable. And we really boiled down the key features to some of the technical aspects. Fedora provides these long-term digital preservation features, like persistence, various flavors of fixity. It supports things like audits, things like versioning, and import-export. These are really the key things when you're talking about a lightweight repository that does the things you want your objects, doesn't do the things that you don't want. You can get it in and out. There are also a couple of areas that Fedora was not currently supporting, but came onto the roadmap because of this process. So one, fixity enhancements. Can you arbitrarily run checksums on demand? Not currently part of it, something that we should do. 2, versioning enhancements. Can you restore previous versions, not just the latest version, on demand? So we actually went through, and I won't read through this, and I apologize for the text, but it was an interesting intellectual exercise to see how Fedora's capabilities map to the OIS functional models for each one of these, and then also for the information model. How does it actually relate? Now, Fedora has got this really flexible and extensible RDF-based data model, so you can basically tie anything you want in, and you can throw a couple of ontologies, and you're good to go. I don't know that, now Fedora supports this, I don't know that anyone has actually done this with a Baroque digital preservation solution, and if you have, it would be great to see it and write it up as a case study. A different case study is from my colleague Chris R. at the University of Hull, where he's looking at how does Hydra work with long-term digital preservation. And so he presented this paper at the PASIG Preservation and Archiving Special Interest Group in Prague in 2016. And he had some good examples about how members of the Hydra, now Samvera community had leveraged Hydra, either infusing it with digital preservation capabilities. In this case, they've done some very interesting work with Archivmatica at University of Hull, At Penn State, they've done some really interesting work trying to archive born digital content, or at other environments like the Royal Library of Denmark, integrating it into part of a larger and complex digital preservation infrastructure where Hydro is really providing the management and the access. So here are some of the things that I have come to, well, here's where people, this is the crazy stuff. Okay. One, maintain a human readable file system. This was so cool in 1998, right? Get over it. No, if you're worried about your file system as a preservation librarian, you are focused on the wrong level. I will exclude the born digital curators for handheld media. That is their job and is a notable exception. But if you are worried about what your sysadmins or where central IT is putting the content and what flavors of disk they're using, you are in the wrong business and you should go work in central IT. That's not where our concern should be. Now, for sysadmins, you should worry about it. Do it right. 2, format migration and registries. 98% of the effort and discussion around format migrations and format registries has been wasted effort. Let's boil it down to the 2%, record the essential things so we're not repeating the wheel, but let's stop worrying about a problem that was really important 15 years ago and has since become much less important. 3, premise events. Why do we want to spend so much time describing all of the things that happen in a digital preservation repository that takes away our ability to actually just bring content in? If it never gets into the repository, it doesn't matter how granular your events are. 4, same thing with provenance and Pravo. Like, there are important things that we can track. The levels of analysis and the postulating that's going on now is not productive and doesn't relate to most of the things that we need to be doing as digital archives. I'm going more quickly. I would have soft-pedaled that if I weren't at the end of time. Okay, so 4 areas where I think repositories could be doing better. 1, 40% of the people in the room, 45%, held up their hands when we had talked about OAIS and trustworthy digital repositories. This is good stuff. Being able to preserve your digital content is one of the primary reasons people put stuff into a repository. There has been 20 years of really solid thinking and practice. We ignore that at our own peril. Read the stuff. Talk about it. Let's have a digital preservation conversation reignited in this community. 2, inside our repository, we kind of treat them as black boxes. Once it goes in, do we actually know where it's going? Do we know when the most recent fixity checks are? Do we actually have great statistics on the number of file formats? Some repositories actually have done a much better job at this than others. I think this should be a more standard feature. 3, understand how your repository fits into the larger digital preservation system and the environment. If it's not a digital preservation system in and of itself, how do you take care of the complete set of concerns that are documented in the standards and that we should be concerned with? 4, import, export, be able to bring content in, be able to take it outside, take it with the accompanying metadata, because your repository is just one part of the relay and you shouldn't be running it in 10 years because you'll be running something better. So, in conclusion, where I think things are going, they're going to shake this up a little bit more. The cloud is here, content addressable storage and policy-based storage. Are we really thinking at the right level about how, as preservationists, we can leverage this? We have lots of conversations about different zones for Glacier and Amazon storage. I don't think we really have a sophisticated understanding of how to leverage this to our benefit yet. And the vendors are actually quite interested in helping us with this. We should be talking to them more. 2, I think there is a growing and clearer distinction between management and access repositories and preservation repositories. I think we're seeing, I'll talk about this in just a second. 3, I think we can do a better job on workflows and pipelines for bringing content in more flexibly to our environments. We need to be able to accommodate a greater diversity of content with bigger pipelines and more flexibility. Some of the commercial products actually are very impressive in this space. I think we're playing catch up. So this is actually the last slide. Thank you, Gail. Long-term digital preservation. Where is digital preservation with repositories? One is it's somewhat invisible. I think part of that is actually a success story. The things that we should care about are already conventional wisdom, and we built them into our repositories and our thinking. So that is good. Two, I think we should celebrate any time content gets into a digital repository that is actually a key step in its preservation. It's in a management environment, there are people taking care of it, and you can provide access to it. That is as much preservation as worrying about premise events. Let's look at what we saw with Andrew and Houston's example as a wonderful step. Three, replication, storage, fixity. These are infrastructure and storage concerns. Let's stop spending so much time on them. Four, I really think that what we saw with Deepin, with systems like Lux, which have been running for 20 years, with commercial providers like Archivum, we are seeing the beginnings of a marketplace where trying to address that succession planning, what happens if you go away? How do you get radical geodiversity? This is part of the new model. And being able to check your content from your management and access repository into a remote preservation store is something that is going to become quite commonplace. So, that's it.
Thanks, Tom. That was terrific. And I think we could have gone on longer. We're almost up the official time for our session, but if people have questions, I'm sure Tom would be happy to answer them. Any questions? I shouldn't give her the mic.
So I would say you and I know that we agree with each other. But one of the concerns, and because most of what you said I would also agree with, but how do you get those people who are so dogmatic about digital preservation to realize that doing that great is the enemy of good? Because I think that is where my struggle is. Like, really, we have to do every single premise event? Do we really? I don't think we do. Do we have to use premise? You already know I don't think we do. So, I mean, that I think is the struggle. It's not necessarily maybe us in the room, but those who are not in the room that need to understand those things.
Does anyone have an answer? I have questions. Rosalind has questions. I don't know the answer to that. I will tell you a story about Rob Cardellano, another colorful character from the community. So Rob runs preservation and IT at Columbia University. The video preservation unit had some stuff that they had transcoded, and they needed to put it in the repository. And they said, it's got to be preservation quality, which means maximum resolution. And it's like 500 terabytes. And Rob says, oh, okay, well, we can't store it. You'll have to get rid of it. And they say, okay, 50 terabytes. We can compress it down to 50 terabytes. And he brought it in. And I think that was a case where the perfect versus the good, with the perfect being equating to zero, good was good enough. Maybe we need more use cases or examples where we can make those trade-offs clear.
Do we have any other questions for Tom?
Linda.
No? Okay, thank you very much. Oh,
do you want, sorry.
Where? Oh, I'm sorry.
Tom, I too agree with most of what you said, with possible exception of not spending as much time on replication and fixity, because I'm not sure the problems really are solved. And I think you know about, well, I know that we might mention your colleague David Rosenthal's famous thought project about how many copies does it really take to keep a terabyte safe for a century, and he concluded we cannot figure that out. We can't afford to actually build the kind of system that would prove how many copies we really do need to keep stuff safe. So the danger is in letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, that we keep increasing the number of copies, or that we keep making our checksum algorithms more and more complicated to guard against all possible hacks. And they take so long to calculate that as the number of terabytes we're storing increases, the checksum checking cannot complete within the given amount of time. And so I think we need to put some, perhaps recognize to what extent we just have not solved these problems. We can't bury them at the infrastructure level and say the IT guys will figure it out, and actually ask some mathematicians to analyze what we're doing and come up with a better formula to tell us what is good enough.
I agree.
Any other questions for Tom? No? Yes, yes. One more.
I think you alluded to it a little bit in your talk about cloud and storage as a service has been becoming more and more popular, even within universities now, over on-premise disk from whatever hardware provider, and that tide seems to be turning a lot of universities where they're looking to, in the past, say, oh, that looked too expensive compared to doing it on-premise. Costs of things like Amazon S3 or the same service in Google, Microsoft Azure is now looking, when they compare the entire operational cost, really good. So my question is, with that shift towards that and those services offering version control, fixity checking, and a whole lot of other things that would typically be in Fedora or a repository system, where does the line blur, and where do you start to need to where do you trust the cloud provider versus with that what they're doing with fixity checking in S3 across behind the scenes 50 data centers is good enough?
So I think, actually, I will take Linda's point, is I think it's time to dip our toes into the cloud water. I would be extremely skeptical about putting your only copy or all copies in the cloud. We've also had multiple conversations with Amazon. They don't actually talk about integrity. They talk about availability, and that is like a billion nines. But they don't actually say that the content won't come back identical. And it's an important and valuable distinction. There's the famous Reagan saying is trust but verify. I do think there is a role for the higher level repository to be doing things like keeping checksums and verifying them. But I think the replication, the healing is appropriately pushed down to other systems. So at this point, I think the digital preservation community needs to figure out how to leverage cloud. I think there's been some good thinking on that, but it's also time to put it into practice. That's happening. I mean, lots of universities, lots of institutions are going cloud first. You have to actually justify why you wouldn't put stuff into a cloud. I do think a couple people are going to get bit by that, and we'll have some lessons if they surface. But we should be actively watching this space over the next few years.
Let's give Tom and our other speakers a round of applause.